Hey, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm here with Brandon Norgaard. He's the co-founder of the Enlightened Worldview Project. I've been hanging with him in a number of different times in the spaces across a wide variety of different domains. Really excited to get to talk to him today. We'll be exploring that and the approaches to Meta-Crises. But first, hey, Brandon, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg.
It's really great that you join us. So why don't we just help the audience with a little bit of background, share a little bit of the narrative about how you got involved in the space in general, and then we can lead into the whole Enlightenment Worldview Project and what's that about.
All right, yeah. So I'm from Folsom, California, which is near Sacramento.
Yep.
And it's an interesting place that there's a convergence of like attempts to use government to improve people's lives here in California, but it doesn't work. And then, you know, we're not that far from Silicon Valley where they have, you know, a really, really high technology development, and that doesn't seem to be getting the job done. So growing up in this environment, I'm thinking, you know, there's a lot of things I'm thinking about how, you know, maybe technology or government reforms could be leveraged, you know. And I started this, I was interested, you know, some of my friends, we started this meetup group where we're talking about all kinds of issues, political, economic, you know, and philosophical, how philosophy can be leveraged to try to sort out some of these great challenges we're dealing with.
Right.
And yeah, so with that, we started getting into just a lot of things, and a lot of topics, a lot of things going on in recent years. You know, it's been going on for almost,
no shortage of things to discuss. Anything in that philosophical group that really caught your eye or that you recall was a major theme or things that are worth sharing in that regard?
Yeah, you know, and some of the regulars who they would introduce me to Game B or the sense making scene, you know, and that's it's really started getting more a bigger thing a few years ago when the world here, the US politics really started having some serious problems. So I'm looking into, we're talking about Game B, we're talking about sense making. And one of the things that really came up is that, you know, we had some people who were just interested in talking about these topics. They're talking about philosophy and politics, but a lot of this stuff is so jargon laden. We wanted to watch videos with, you know, Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall, and I came to realize, okay, so this is really brilliant stuff, but a lot of these people who join these discussion groups, it doesn't make sense to them. It's I could see that these guys were offering pieces of the puzzle to address the larger challenges that we're facing. But you know, I can see that this is reasonable criticism. But this is these guys, you know, a little bit of motor mouthing. It's a little difficult to understand them. And
I don't know what that's like at all. Don't. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm trying to explain it I'm trying to listen carefully enough to see, okay, here's how I would explain this to people who don't have a background in these areas. So people who are all, you know, they're pretty well educated, but they're not familiar with all of the jargon and the background. You know, they haven't read all those books. And then I realized, okay, we can actually do this. This is something, this content, if we could find a way to convey it to people, you know, to help, they can leverage it, they can improve their lives, you know, and their communities. If we can convey it to them in a way that can connect, because there's a sophistication spectrum. You know, there's the people who develop these advanced ideas, this next generation thinking, and, you know, they talk to each other often. You know, you can't really do that development unless you're using a specialized jargon. But then there's a translation process to bring it to people in a way that is not only understandable but also inspiring. You know, so I got some close friends of mine. We got some practice doing that, and we started thinking, okay, why don't we create like a little organization based on doing this, you know? And that's where we got this. Yes, the Enlightened Worldview Project. I'm hearing, in fact, a lot about this notion of Enlightenment 2.0, and that's, I wanted to make that central to the project. I'm also hearing about people talking about different worldviews. You know, and the incompatibility. You're coming from this, your worldview is your primary, belief system and your orientation to the world. So it's your primary ontology and epistemology and value system. A lot of these people, they kind of tend to be a little tribal about that. So maybe we could use the new enlightenment. That is the, as you've defined it, and I think that maybe this is something worth talking about. I wasn't sure where the term Enlightenment 2.0 originally came from, but I think that you've articulated it better than anybody prior to you, as far as I could tell. And that's the, like, you're taking the concepts from the Western Age of Enlightenment of, like, we're going to get away from the traditional, dogmatic, belief systems. We're going to, use science and reason to improve or to make progress in the world. And to a large extent, that happened. But then there's also the postmodern critique of, essentially what it ends up being, if you give it long enough. This Age of Enlightenment ideals tends to just empower some people, cause all kinds of, there's a lot of people who are, left behind. So we want to have individual rights. We want to recognize people's struggles and emancipation. We also want to recognize that scientific knowledge, or this quest for logic and reason and progress can actually lead to some people having power over others. So there's that postmodern critique. So being mindful of that, and also as you've articulated it, there's the Enlightenment gap, wherein they never figured out the relationship between the mind and science. Like, how do you have a science? What is the definition essentially of psychology? And also, how do we have a scientific way of going about social science? So sociology and economics, those have never been quite as scientific as they could be. So I was wondering about this notion of Enlightenment 2.0, where, I think I might have defined it pretty well just now, but where did that term actually come from?
If you look around, several people have used it, and I would say that I generated it and quickly Googled it and saw that it was already around. So it popped into my head. Shortly after it popped in my head, early on in my relationship with Lenny Rachel Anderson and her folk Bildung system, we were corresponding, and she had a Bildung conference, and I developed a poster, and in the center of it is Enlightenment 2.0. So she had that, and I'm not sure if she had a particular lineage. Like I said, people have published on that in the past, and so there's certainly a sense of a need for a new paradigmatic shift amongst many people who think about John Vervaeke and the axial age kind of revolution that he's calling for. So it's definitely in the air that we're in need of a new shift. A subset of people have framed it in relationship to Enlightenment 2.0. I think some of us in this unique, specific meta-modern space, and now I'm specifically referring to Lenny and I, because we actually, I was like, oh my God, one of our first synergistic moments was, hey, you very shortly after I had sort of said, hey, I think I'm involved in an Enlightenment 2.0 project. I saw her with that, and the gestalt that she had on the board was very similar. But I then bring a particular angle. This is a huge potential concept. The Enlightenment has many, many things. I bring a particular angle concerned with the meaning, mental health crisis, with a particular aspect on the logos of our scientific, psychological, philosophical, social scientific humanities cluster, and then I diagnose, I am the owner of the originator of the term Enlightenment gap, which folks, listen to the program regularly will know. It's my claim that there are at least two really gigantic synthetic philosophical problems that are closely related, but also separable. That's the mind-matter problem, consciousness and physics. I'm actually recently framing this in terms of physics and psyche, and the proper relationship of physics and psyche. But that whole dynamic relation that as modern empirical science emerged and its behavioral third-person empirical quantitative perspective, it never really gets a place where it can reintegrate the qualitative subjective conscious experience. And then you have this whole issue about, well, scientific knowledge, and it affords a particular kind of view, realistic view of the universe that was novel, more sophisticated, but it was also contextualized in social knowledge. And we see the debate, sort of epistemological debate between modernity, postmodernity, as trying to figure out, well, what is the epistemic value, say, of science relative to the social construction of knowledge in imminent historical situated power-based contexts? Well, the modern versus postmodern divide. And so for me, then you get the UTOK comes in, creates a synthetic philosophy, resolves the Enlightenment gap, and affords a new meta-modern sensibility that allows a lot more coherence, so we can place psychology and the social sciences in proper relationship to the physical natural sciences, and also in proper relationship to sort of humanities, theology, wisdom orientations. And then with that coherence, we can afford sort of the second half of the Enlightenment project, which we can say initially got the physical sciences into the biological sciences reasonably well situated, but not anywhere near to situating the psychological, social sciences, and theology or science and spirituality relation. And voila, we are now seeing a new emergent worldview, a new emergent understanding of science, the cognitive sciences, psychology, social sciences, the fact value thing is all coming online, so that I think we have the outline of something that can genuinely solve that historical gap and then launch us into a totally different worldview. And then if we cultivate that inside of sort of the, arcane academic solution that some of us work on, but really the fundamental question is, well, how do we take that arcane academic solution, actually translate it into people so that it makes a difference in their lives? And of course, the Enlightenment Worldview Project is exactly that placement, and why I so honor what it is that you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah. So and indeed, so it's bringing together science and the humanities, and also Eastern, the notion of, the Western Enlightenment and the Eastern Enlightenment. Sure. And there are people who are working on this, some decades ago in some form or another. And I'm not, as I guess neither one of us here are sure who came up with the term Enlightenment 2.0, but the whole framing made a lot more sense with your concept of the Enlightenment gap. So I can say that people were talking about similar things, but it really started to connect with that. And then there is that process, as you're saying, of bringing this to people in a way that they can understand it. It inspires them to improve their life and their community and their world.
Yeah. So can you we'll get into some other dynamics of the whole Meta-Crisis thing, but maybe you say a little bit more about what you do with the Enlightenment Worldview Project, and kind of where is it, and how has it emerged to get to where it is, and then do you have future hopes for it, or what do you see in relationship to that?
Yeah. So, well, for one thing, you've heard about this concept of the liminal web.
Yeah.
And, when, in fact, it was, that term has only been around for a few months with Joe Lightfoot. And,
yes, he made that term, now stamped it into the culture.
There's other terms, like, I guess, approximate equivalents, like the so-called sense-making web or the emergentia. Sure. And in fact, that was the term, the emergentia. I first heard about this when we were starting this Enlightened Worldview Project. And some people, essentially, that was what we were seasoning upon. Like, these people, they talk about things that are, next generation thinking, that are so brilliant, but how do we bring this to the people? How do we take that? How do we take things, now I can say within the liminal web, how can we implement these ideas at the community level? So a lot of these people, they're looking for greater inner peace and tranquility in their relationships with others and among people within their community. And there is unnecessary conflict on the inside and the outside. So we have, there's psychological therapists such as yourself, such as a lot of other people within your field. But we were thinking, okay, why aren't there sociological therapists?
Beautiful.
This is a role that used to be played by, pastors. But then what if it was more secular? you know, so it's not someone who is coming from a specific like spiritual perspective, you know.
Yep.
And we think that every community needs people like this.
Yes,
and
I love that. Yeah.
So this would be based on a few things, you know, and we would leverage the concept of Bildung as Lena Rachel Anderson has brought to the forefront with the folk Bildung 3.0, because her research found that there were at least 2 iterations of this Bildung from past generations.
Exactly.
So this is the self-cultivation, you know, lifelong learning and community development all working in conjunction. But there's also other aspects of this that I figure these sort of community leaders would need to be familiar with. And it would also involve, you know, the sense making, like helping people sort out fact from fiction in the news. Like, what if you had community leaders who could guide people through that and the relation that has to inner development? You know, so you're working on inner development, because that helps you understand, you know, what is good science, what is bad science. We figure that people should be encouraged or to think kind of like a scientist, kind of like a journalist, you know. Like whereas the past, it was always like, you know, trust the science. And in fact, they're still saying that with the movie. People are celebrating the movie Don't Look Up, and I like the movie, you know. But it was also the message. One of the main messages was trust the science. But I think that in order to trust the science, you actually need to kind of understand, need to think like a scientist at that meta sense making level.
Right.
So you can kind of discern what is reasonable, what is good science versus bad science. And it's not just, oh, I trust this science. It's like, this one seems to be the most reasonable to me in light of these factors, you know?
Yep. No, I really appreciate that articulation, both in the sense that I do believe that science, when done right, both at an epistemological and at a broad but not overly committed ontological level, meaning our shared understanding of kind of reality from, say, a big history kind of view ontologically, and the epistemological critique mindset that science brings, super important. At the same time, as somebody who's a deep critic of what's happened to my field and the way it also gets translated into policy, like, oh, cognitive behavior therapy is the therapy that's as scientifically supported. I used to believe that, and then you realize that's actually bullshit when you get into the back room and understand it. It's very, very tricky. And of course, one of the things about UTOK, and I think if we could organize our sense-making system to afford the optimal grip regarding what we know and afford more and more people to have access to what that is, and then utilize that as an outline and then recognize the pluralism around that, we will be in much better stead to make good sense-making. And it seems to me that, you know, the Enlightenment Worldview Project is very much about how we would cultivate a shift in that direction.
Yeah, so it's basically like, how do scientists do their work? Like there is that like more general basic sense making that they have to employ in their work, and also journalists. They do investigations within their work, and so do you know, like if you're on a jury, you have to figure out, you know, is this, you know, guilt or innocence, right? And these are sort of cognitive skills that people need to employ in their daily lives in order to have this inner peace, in order to have this tranquility with their relationships. So we figure that there could be community leaders who are trained in a broad range of these, at least to some extent, in a broad range of these sense-making community building practices, such that they could help their members in their community, you know, do better sense making, have greater inner peace, have greater you know, tranquility, and kind of like general practitioner physicians, you know, how they are a little bit familiar with you know, ears, nose, throat, eyes, you know, all kinds of other, you know, knees, whatever. They know something about that. And then they can offer referrals to experts as necessary. So what if there was some sort of a, you know, practice of these people wherein under certain circumstances, they would realize that they need to offer referrals to some expert organization within this greater liminal web. Because there's some of these organizations are doing, circling or authentic relating or other kinds of inner work, or spirituality. And so you're not going to have experts at every one of those fields in every community, but what if we had general practitioners at that level,
Totally. That really resonates with me in the sense that, in fact, for a whole host of reasons, but one of the very serious identity reasons, I gave up my license as last June, I decided not to renew my license after 25 years. And part of it was my identity in regards to what I felt like was necessary for society. And that was, we needed to extract the wisdom of the psychotherapy room and get it out of the professional, cloistered, informed consent behind closed doors, and realize that we've extracted a lot of very important, pretty generalized common sense principles that we can, if we are effective, we can tie them together and then distribute them into families, into communities, into schools. And then, the image very much, I think, is what you're articulating would be, we'd have sort of point leaders who are able to serve as wisdom guides in various communities and sort of the, secular pastors or whatever in relationship to giving people the opportunity to gain a reference for sense making, a reference for inner work, a reference for kind of like, wow, how are we actually going to pull together around this meaning mental health crisis and collectively shift rather than 1 hour at a time with one individual at a time, which from an efficiency and really diagnostic structural problem is just missing the boat. So I really appreciate the layering and level of analysis that you're offering there.
Yeah, so and this is a pretty big vision that we've got here, and this is kind of like, we're putting this idea together as a little bit of a trial balloon, like sure. There's a pretty big ramping up process to get there. So this is just initially, it's like who is interested? Does this idea make sense? This grand vision, and well, some of us could come together and maybe have courses to train community leaders and then have, the sort of directory that they can access to bring in these experts as necessary.
Beautiful.
So that's kind of the vision, kind of in the early stages here. And so, to some extent with this, we started, about 3 years ago with this project. We weren't aware of a lot of the things that are already out there, in entering this liminal web, and a lot of it has actually come online with other organizations just in the last year, and so we don't want to step over anybody's toes. It's, some of what I'm talking about here is already out there. We just want to fill in the gaps of what isn't there. And some of what, we were talking about, 3 years ago is there already, and some of it isn't. So as far as I can tell, there isn't anything like this out there. The general framework that I'm talking about. And I think it's doable. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to take to get there, but it's something that we want to implement.
Beautiful. And of course, now, actually, maybe this is a good transition point, because one of the things that really sparked us is your work on thinking about sort of the various approaches, because as you started to build your project, then you've been very diligent about exploring what is out there. And in that regard, it seems to me that you've developed a sort of a lay of the land, maybe very much like Joe Lightfoot's, liminal web thing, but you laid out in a Medium article on the approaches to the Meta-Crises. And one of the things that I would really like to dialogue and listen to is sort of like, take us through kind of what your survey of that landscape is. What did you see? How do you make sense out of that map and that spacing? And what did you write about in that work?
Yeah. And that came from 3 different things, at least, one of which was the article that Jonathan Rowson wrote a few months ago about the, 10 flavors of the Meta-Crisis.
Right.
He wants us to take in all of and stew in all of the, interrelated problems and crises and recognize that there aren't simple solutions to this. So at the probably
tasting the pickle article, right? That's the tasting the pickle.
Yeah. So we have this ecological crisis, and we depend on our biosphere. So that's probably the number one important thing. But then we have, the political crisis that's preventing us from actually addressing that. We have education and sense-making crisis preventing, that's keeping people from really recognizing that things are, as bad as they are. And, it's not like there's a comet hitting the Earth in just a few months. It is a little bit like that. It might take some decades, but it's still like, this is something we need to take serious action on in the short term. And, and sociocultural crisis where people aren't getting along with each other, especially people from different backgrounds in life. We have some people who are struggling to get by while others have enormous amounts of wealth,
Inequality.
And so how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this? And so that one of them, so one source is that article that he wrote, what Jonathan Rowson wrote.
Okay.
And it's also, Joe Lightfoot, having that article about the landscape of the liminal web and all the different organizations working, in meta-modern, integral theory, game B, et cetera, adjacent spaces, and how they're interrelated. Another one is actually some of the things that you've been talking about, because you have a lot of these guests on your program. You put out a lot of articles you've been talking about. One thing that kind of light bulb went off in my mind was when you were contrasting between Enlightenment 2.0 and the so-called Dark Renaissance. So I guess that I realized that even though, I like the notion of enlightenment. That's why I created the Enlightened Worldview Project. But not to be too presumptuous. I want to give a hearing to other ways of seeing things. So I wanted to kind of look at this. I wanted to look at the teleology of these different organizations within the liminal web and how they're similar to each other, how they're different from each other. So I looked at that, and I created this spreadsheet. It's linked from the Medium article, and also a diagram.
Right.
I guess the way that I thought to first categorize it was based on spiral dynamics, the different thought perspectives or value means.
Actually, let me just pause you there, and people will probably know this, but I'll just give them some framing. So maybe we can dialogue a little bit more going forward, but just to make a reference. So the Dark Renaissance emerged on Alexander Bard's intellectual deep web as a framing for his vision that came out of his Syntheism series, and then the Digital Libido and Process Event, I think, is his next one that he's working on. And as I'm a member of that, and I love Alexander Bard, we're good friends along those lines, and I was deeply influenced first by Syntheism and Digital Libido, but it's also the case that the tenor and tone and vision that Bard has in relationship to what the intellectual deep web is about feels very different in some ways than the Theory of Knowledge Society, my work with John Vervaeke, et cetera. And over a little bit of dialogue, as I delineated that, we then were able to specify that the flavors that we are seeing in the future could be well characterized by Enlightenment 2.0 versus Dark Renaissance. Indeed, that's the title of, I think it's episode 9 or whatever on UTOKing when I had Bard here. So anyway, that's just a little bit of the backdrop of that particular distinction. And it's interesting to hear that as you sort of internalize that distinction, then it became apparent that, yes, we should see the mapping of the various approaches to the Meta-Crises.
Yeah. So after looking at, that was the primary way to differentiate it, because some of these people who there's a lot of agreement, a lot of agreement among people who that we're facing these multiple crises, and that we should do something about it. And so what is the primary hinge point of agreement or disagreement? And I use spiral dynamics, or something close to that. A lot of writers have been doing work in this area, and that's where you have the sort of indigenous approaches or the traditional approaches, which is kind of a religious comes from that, and then you have the modern, like maybe we can use modern science, maybe we can have this rational enlightenment, and this is something that Steven Pinker has been promoting with his book Enlightenment Now.
Pretty exemplifying.
Partially an embrace of his work, but partially, a reaction against it. And so we can call that Enlightenment 1.5, I suppose, because he has a pretty simplistic view of it. He thinks that we can keep doing more of what we've done already.
Yes.
More of the same, values and intellectual, like psychotechnologies that got us, that brought humanity out of the dark ages, and that improved the lives of so many people, especially in the the 19th and 20th centuries. And if we just implement that further and deeper, then we will overcome the challenges of our time. So that seems to be his thesis in his recent books. But he is also disdainful of any kind of postmodernism or critical theory. So
I agree.
I think it's a little bit simplistic, so we can call that Enlightenment 1.5.
Yeah, I really like that. I'll just say in my own history when I discovered the problem of psychotherapy, 1993, 1994, I then backed up and said, well, what's the best framing for this? And then fell into evolutionary psychology, 1995 or so, and found Steve Pinker's The Language Instinct. And he worked with some of the leaders, Barkow, Cosmides, John Tooby. And I was a real admirer of his view. And I think he's a brilliant guy, and I have an enormous amount of respect for him. But man, has my worldview changed since 1995. And so I appreciate the 1.5 version. Yes, I think that's a good characterization. And no, I do not think that the old Enlightenment, just more of that, is the actual solution. I think he drifts into scientism. In fact, at times he's even endorsed that term. It's like, really, can't really do too much. I've never really seen too much scientism. I was like, well, go to psychology, okay? The parenting of the scientific method and the praying to God of methodological fundamentalism, to me, is a crystal clear articulation that old school, straightforward, modern academic notions of science are not up to the task of what's necessary to guide us further. So I completely agree with your characterization there.
Well, yeah. So, but if you look at the landscape that I've been looking, in the diagram, we could do worse than what Steve Pinker is advocating.
God, yeah, no.
So in that regard,
definitely do worse than Steve.
His works, his books, in that sort of a perspective, can be a scaffold to people who are at earlier versions. Because I do have here, the so-called Leviathan. There are some people who think in terms of the Hobbes's book, from the 17th century, that we just need someone to have someone all power, and then sort out. He'll be so powerful that he'll sort out anything, And
fingers crossed. Good luck with that.
You also have. I figure that there's some people who are ethnocentric, doom or defeatists, who their approach is just to save themselves, save your family, save your ethnic group. You get people like that. It's pretty sad. There's also some people who still believe in some sort of religious fundamentalism, and this is not when I say that there's problems, and a lot of people agree, that there's some problems with that. It's not an attack on religion, but the approach that Steven Pinker is offering can be a scaffold to people who have those sort of perspectives. But then there's so many problems and I think this is a big thing that's going on in our culture war now, is that some people want to really latch on to this enlightenment, something like Enlightenment 1.5, whether they use that term or not.
Sure.
In their fights against then there's some other people who have more of a postmodern view, because they realize that is oppressive to a lot of people.
Totally.
So we have to have these sort of second tier approaches to be comfortable with the tension between science rationality and the inner world perspectives, and
completely
recognizing the limitations of rationality. So that's why I have within this map here, I have a lot of these meta-modern or integrative approaches that I'm talking about here.
Right. So as you move up to 1.5, then just take us through the spiral. Then absolutely.
All right. Yeah. So, and before I go there, I've probably mentioned that there are some postmodern approaches as well. Like we can say that's revolutionary anti-capitalist or Marxism. That's kind of a postmodern approach, but none of those postmodern approaches ever really worked. And so we have then the second tier approaches that are
well,
somehow.
I will say that inside the academy, there's a very strong anti-racist DEI ethos that I think we could identify. In fact, if you take it from a critical perspective, John McWhorter's, woke religion, or I believe that's the title of his book. But anyway, basically there is an enormously powerful social justice movement that we could identify, and obviously Wilbur does with his mean green meme kind of deal. But I can say as an academic, and indeed Steve Pinker, in fact, he came up because there was a movement to get rid of him as a linguistic fellow, and I had some conversations maybe a year or so ago about that particular controversy. So, and he's representing, white modernists and Enlightenment, and then tangled a little bit with the very, very strong postmodern movement, at least at the institution. And so you can look at, white fragility, how to be an anti-racist as sort of Bibles for at least that version of maybe the current ethos from a postmodern green kind of perspective.
Yeah, you're right. And there's probably several of these approaches that I didn't exactly have in this version of the map quite yet. Some of it was getting a little,
Yeah, no, you gotta consider, but all I could say is, like, if there is a real movement towards postmodernism, my experience is actually the institutional identity of the academy has basically flipped into that mode, especially if you merge sort of a post-structuralist idea with oppression narratives and the reversal of oppression narratives as the fundamental orienting mission, which of course at the basic sentiment level I completely agree with. However, the way it's getting realized and the ideological grounding of that realization is something, of course, I'm very critical of at times. But anyway, there is definitely a movement out there in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to make another version of this, essentially transcribing what you just said there. I want to make it as comprehensive as possible and intuitive to people. So if people look at this and they're saying, well, there's something obviously missing, then that's a problem, And but that what you're talking about is another first tier approach where people that the solution to the meta-crisis, or what they perceive to be the greatest challenges of our time, is something that can be just reduced to some sort of narrative. So the second tier approaches there are various narratives, there are various different value memes that can somehow be combined in a creative sort of way. So we can combine the modern and the postmodern and even traditional in some sort of way, and we can be okay with the tension and produce something integrative or meta-modern.
Totally.
And so I looked at that. I looked at, okay, all these integrative or meta-modern approaches. There's quite a few of them. There's quite a few, and I saw that there seems to be some that are would call first generation approaches, because several of these are based on the notion that they seem to have identified the true hinge point that would allow us to make progress in heading off dystopia and working toward relative utopia. And so I don't want to mischaracterize any of these, but it seems like some proponents, they're at least they're aware of the meta-crisis, and they're saying this is what we need. And then those are first generation approaches, and then the kind of the second generation approaches are those that derive from those and recognize that we need to actually bring together various approaches in a creative way, and several of these integrative approaches can be synthesized. So I'm seeing Enlightenment 2.0 in essence as a first generation approach, because it isn't detailed enough, but there are several other approaches that in some way derive from that. So that's what I have in the map, and I identified six first generation approaches.
Okay.
Although something you said about a half hour ago makes me think one of them maybe shouldn't have been a first generation approach, but I'll get to that in a moment here.
Okay.
So Enlightenment 2.0, so it's essentially the idea with these are things that I would agree with in some way, but they're probably not comprehensive as a full approach that we can embrace. The implementation is a little vague. So Enlightenment 2.0 is one. We've talked about that. Game B is one. which, that's the leveraging of game theory. Like, we're all in this game of life, and there's a lot of people who are losing at the game of life, and we want to figure out what sort of rules can we have for our society to run on, such that things aren't so based on rivalry, where some people are just trying to maximize their own, resources and disregard for, the livelihood of others. So that's what we have now with game A, and game B would be, trying to figure out how we can all win at the game of life. I guess that's one way to frame it.
One way to
but again,
frame
that's
it.
that's not super detailed. So I'm seeing that as a first generation approach. Also, meta sense making. That's this idea that we're going to look at how do we make sense, and we've talked about that, earlier. And it's like, how do scientists think? How do journalists think? How do jurors on a jury think? Those are three different kind of roles that people play in society. That I figure, a lot of people just in general need to think like that. And if we can promote that better, then that can be an approach to the Meta-Crisis. But it's another vague one. It's like, okay, so
is that really like rebel wisdom? Would that be rebel wisdom?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So I also have ecology of mind and warm data as a first generation approach, because some of the things, this is Norbert Bateson.
Sure.
I would figure that, kind of based on the notion of Enlightenment 2.0, is a little bit of stage theory is a little bit baked into that. So it seems like if we're gonna have what would Norbert Bateson's warm data approach, it would probably be a little bit separate from that. So because she's not into stage theory,
there's a little blow up with Daniel Gortz and some other. I know all the little debates that are happening in the community.
So ecology of mind with the the notion that any categories are contextually based, and that you need to understand the holistic ecology of how things are interconnected, and then you can start to make better decisions in life, rather than to think that you have this map, because that is admittedly the Enlightenment approach of your work, and anyone who I would consider to be a part of Enlightenment 2.0, is that there's some sort of master map. You may say okay, well, the map isn't the territory. But Nora's approach, she doesn't even like to use maps at all, because you tend to think of reality as being, adhering to that map. So it ends up being a little bit, as she says, BS and colonial as hell.
I mean, certainly I would embrace the contextualization of that. One of the things I often say is, like trade knowledge, it's a situated map that slices a particular aspect to see a good chunk of the territory. But you don't necessarily want to be imagine that you've now decontextualized yourself and seen a God's eye view of the world. And if you do that, you will have definitely fallen into a trap that Nora wants to warn us against. So I would certainly agree with that. But as a meta-systemic guy, I'm like, no, there's actually a lot of value in doing that also. It's a both and kind of position. As a proper second tier person, I think about it.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with maps. I'm creating maps myself here. I just wanted to, I'm actually, in fact, what I'm doing here is a map. I just wanted to give that hearing to the different perspectives on that as a part of this whole thing. Due diligence, not to presume that Enlightenment 2.0 is necessarily the way to get us out of this, And then we also have the Folkbildung 3.0, and I put this as a first generation approach, because it seems to emphasize more of the community development, and it has more of a connection to the history of the development of communities and nation building than the others. And but now, one thing you said actually about a half hour ago was that Lena Rachel Anderson had actually maybe kind of considered it to be situated within Enlightenment 2.0, and thus it wouldn't be, as I'm seeing, I guess if that was the case, it wouldn't be a first generation approach. But whatever.
whatever. I mean, you would have to talk with her about this. And again, yes, these are mapping things in relationship to, I think it's a good sense making tool relative to the taxonomic precision about where people would actually line up. We probably don't want to be overcommitted to those kinds of things. But yeah, no, I think that's good.
It's not that important of a detail. I did show it to her, and she didn't, say anything about that in particular. But so, and then finally, you have the Dark Renaissance, as we've discussed, and this is the notion that the continued dominance of disembodied rationality in science will not make our life better. It'll further denigrate our culture. And if we're thinking in terms of problems and solutions all the time, this will likely only further tie us in knots and create more shadows, so, and it's also the, expectation that, there's likely going to be a dark period going forward. So we can start to have these aesthetic movements that can then create this renaissance in the coming years, So those are the first generation approaches. And the ones that I think have the most possibility of really making big change in the world are those that somehow integrate those. Those are would be second generation approaches. So we can see that there is some tension across those six, or even if I were to whittle it down to five, there's still some tension there in the fundamental approaches, but those can then be integrated. So you can have approaches that integrate between Enlightenment 2.0 and warm data and Dark Renaissance. So I took a stab at looking at what are these more specific, more comprehensive approaches, and how do they then derive from two or more of these, first generation approaches in some sort of way. And so we have, for example, Ken Wilber and Andrew Cohen have this conscious evolution that is just a little bit something that we were kind of talking about, in the email thread, is like, what are the fundamental concepts of evolution that cut across all the planes of existence, and if you could hack that, if you could understand, be mindful of that, then you can understand, then you can overcome any challenges, or at least this is the thinking. I don't know. It seems a little bit out there, right? So that's why it's not super popular. I mean, it was a pretty amazing idea back 20 some years ago, but the details haven't been fleshed out yet. It's something that makes sense within a lot of these spiritual communities, but isn't quite as popular as some of these other ones that I'm going to highlight here. I also have Brendan Graham Dempsey's Meta-Modern Spirituality, which is, it involves the integration of psyches and societies through the creation of ecologies of practice and the development of the so-called religion that is not a religion. So, and this is also, you have John Vervaeke as a contributor to this, and other people. So this is like the idea is that we have, we're going to have collective capacity for large-scale strength, robustness, anti-fragility, health, and coordination. And that's in the words of Layman Pascal there. And
sweet. I'll be going to a Meta-Modern conference in May, so that'll be all sorts of fun up in Vermont. So I might be there too. Hey, that'd be great, man. Love to see you there.
And so then we have I put down here. So a lot of this comes from the book that Perspectiva Press published a few months ago. That's the Dispatches from a Time Between Worlds. Totally. You can see that Brent Cooper had an approach that integrates, seems to integrate the concepts of Enlightenment 2.0 with Marxism, which we can call, he's calling manifesting mass metanoia. And it's based on this concept of post-capitalism, which is that we need a personal, collective transformation within organizations, businesses, governments, and institutions. And we need a change of mind at scale now to recognize our collective, have collective consciousness of, forces of oppression and stuff like that. So that's an approach. And we have here another one is deep code, which I believe was coined by Jordan Hall. It's also I think that Bonita Roy and Forrest Landry are behind some aspects of this as well. So it's like that we need an understanding of the foundational basis that underlies our ontology, epistemology, ethics, and phenomenology, and also understand the generator functions for civilization, so that we can bring about create a new civilization system before we destroy our biosphere and everything that depends on it. So that's the deep code.
let's crack the deep code, people.
Yeah. So and then also a few months ago, Jamie Wheal came out with a book, Recapture the Rapture, where he's talking about meaning 3.0. And this involves scientific research to create so-called ethical cults that can carefully integrate rituals, drugs, sex, and altered states of consciousness with the aim of realizing meaning 3.0. As you know, as he's talking about, there was a meaning 1.0, which was the traditional religion, and meaning 2.0 is like, oh, I just want to, accumulate more stuff in this world and be, get a big house and a big car, and that's my meaning. Right. So meaning 3.0 is something like, and this is based in part on Vervaeke's meaning crisis. So he thinks, but this is where Jamie Wheal thinks that we can leverage, what he calls neuroanthropology. And, have ethical cults to strengthen communities and improve and optimize human performance.
Yes, I've been meaning to get that book, Jamie Wheal's book. I've heard good things about it on Stoa and other places, and yes, it's a good reminder of that vision.
All right, and then so another thing is we got micro solidarity, and this is something that Joe Lightfoot is heavily involved in. Involves what he calls pods, squads, crews, and gangs, which are 4 versions of micro solidarity emerging within the so-called liminal web, and there are small communities of small mutual aid communities for people to do all kinds of personal development in good company for social benefit. And so
that's good. I'd heard some about that. I'm looking forward to learn a little bit more. Can you say a little bit more about do you know much about where Lightfoot's project is on those micro solidarities? Like, I mean, what's the size of that community? Where is it in its development? It's mostly just a prototype idea, or has he really got people operating in?
Yeah, it's also Richard Bartlett is also of Inspiral is behind it. I added this to the list after I showed this to Joe, and he suggested adding that in. And one thing I know is that he is working on an article, and by the time anybody out there watches this, the article might be out there, published already. But I guess I don't have that much more on that particular.
Fair enough. I don't know anything about
it. So we got another one is the localization and bioregionalism, or the so-called doomer optimism, which is an approach that advocates for localized alternatives to the global economy, particularly involving the creation of robust local food systems and democratic structures that can effectively resist authoritarianism and economic globalization. And the idea is that there is something to look forward to when certain pathological and outdated institutions in our contemporary world begin to fail and collapse. Since
good to have a backup plan.
Different ways of being in the world can emerge. So for example, you have the military industrial complex. They're in 20 years in Afghanistan, trillions of dollars, and then what did that do? So it might get to the point where we're not going to be spending quite so much money on the military, and then maybe that's a good thing. No doubt. And certainly not a very good bang for your buck. You got to admit.
Certainly not in the Afghanistan thing. That's for sure.
All right, and Joe also suggested I add this one here based on the work of Fritjof Capra and Jeremy Lent, which is, I guess we couldn't think of a really, really good term for this, but since it's based in part on Taoism and Chinese, thought, we're calling it the yin and yang web of systems, and it involves being mindful of the systemic interconnectedness of global problems, energy shortages, environmental degradation, climate change, economic inequality, violence, war, aggravating one of them will have an influence on the others. So it's very important to be mindful of the deep interconnectedness of ecology and how our worldviews are formed as they change, and how they can be changed. And so in addition, I talked to Jeremy Johnson, and he's a, Gebzerian scholar. And
right.
His approach is it's not the same thing as the Wilberian conscious evolution. It's so it involved, this is what we're calling mutations into the integral aperspectival. It involves cohering aperspectival thinking, developing the mutational model, catalyzing the integral mutation through discontinuous leap into new modes of participatory sense making, and worlding through cultural phenomenology. We can develop at a planetary felt sense.
All right. Great.
And
so it seems, is it fair to say when the second tier feel much more sort of translational and enacted and, sort of grounded in the construction of living communities, maybe, whereas the first generation a little bit more ideational, perhaps? I'm not sure, but that's some of what I'm hearing in relationship to
that's correct. Yeah. So yeah, to clarify, I'm using the term the languaging of spiral dynamics, where they're differentiating between first tier and second tier. So all of these, there's quite a few of these that I have as second tier, but then I'm talking about first generation versus second generation. And the first generation are ideational, as I'm seeing it, and the on the ground implementation is a little bit vague. So that's why you have in all of these cases, all these second generation approaches, I'm seeing them borrow from at least two or more of the first generation approaches. So in that we actually can, and I think that we can actually bring together even more of these, that maybe haven't been formulated yet. I'm just listing the ones that have been formulated that I'm aware of.
Sure.
So there's more approaches that I'm noticing. You have, for example, peer-to-peer, which involves people cooperatively pooling their resources through commons in a way that is complementary to business and government, with the idea that this can create prosperity for all. One of the main guiding principles is so-called cosmolocalism. This is spearheaded by Michel Bowens.
Yep. And
then also just
on the program not too long ago.
Just recently, there's this notion of Web3 was created. This is all being spearheaded by Jordan Hall. It's the collective name for the latest wave of innovation, which is touted as being more decentralized, democratic, and creative than the current web ecosystems. So whereas Web 1 was the start of the internet, with a lot of these startups and stuff, and then Web 2 is where major social media companies came in, and they own the data, and it's more interactive, but it's also, it leads to just a few companies having so much power. So Web 3, it's partially based on the so-called blockchain technology and decentralized autonomous organizations and stuff. And it's the idea that we can get away from the major social media companies and have more, democratic control within the internet.
Exactly.
And so my personal favorite among these is the Listening Society and Nordic Ideology of Hansi Freinacht books. And it's not just because my last name is Norgaard.
Now, is this a second tier? You have this classified as second tier?
Second generation.
Second generation. I did that again. Sorry.
Yeah. I don't know. I should use less overlapping terminology.
No, that's fine. It's clear. I just misspoke. So yeah, got it.
Yeah. So I see this definitely within the Nordic ideology. There's a section making clear that they are deriving from Enlightenment 2.0, and they're also deriving from Game B. They are saying we need to not have game denial, but game and nor game acceptance. We want game change. So, and they're also saying that they're embracing the notion of Bildung in this. So I'm figuring they're partially based on folk Bildung 3.0 and bringing all this together. And what I really like about this approach is that recognizing that at a local level, you need at least these 6 different kinds of institutions working in conjunction with each other. And so some of which we've already talked about in the program. I found ways to work each of these in, especially when I was talking about, the Enlightened Worldview Project.
Right.
And so like essentially sense making and what they use the word Gemeinschaft, but that's like essentially the community building and the strengthening democracy, emancipation, and finding ways to give people meaning through better narratives, and there's I know there's 6 just to make sure. So the those need all work together in conjunction with each other within that approach. And I'm figuring, for the Enlightened Worldview Project, I want to kind of leverage that sort of map. I think that would make sense, and it doesn't have to be exactly sliced and diced the way that they have it, but I think they have a pretty good pattern, because those different 6 types of institutions, which can be implemented by government or by private companies or by just civil society. Each of those, they're based on a pattern of the first and second and third person epistemologies. So that's why I was figuring, if we were to try to implement this, which is something I think that we can implement this within the United States to try to improve the culture here, we could somehow categorize these different organizations within the liminal web based on are they similar to this type of institution as the Hansi Freinacht has outlined it, this or that, and just to make sure that you're checking at least all those boxes, right?
Right.
So that you have, this gets back to what I was saying before about, Enlightened Worldview, how you would have community leaders who would be able to offer referrals to this or that, sort of organization within the liminal web, if they were somehow categorized. And again, it wouldn't have to be exactly the same sort of categorization scheme, but I like that they have a map. I like that the Hansi Freinacht books has essentially a master map for how to categorize these organizations for next generation thinking,
Right. Yeah, no, that's really useful.
And I think that about wraps it up. Did I miss
that was
one?
what I was wondering. I was thinking. Yeah.
I did actually miss one, but that's the so-called Bright Future Now of Robert Gilman. He did a series of presentations on the Stoa, where he's talking about planetary consciousness and aiming for sustainability, and made possible through systems thinking and mindfulness of the neurochemical psychology and finding the optimal zone. So,
all right, great. So, hey, thank you. That is very valuable, and I think that the people who listen to this podcast definitely, have a sense of some of that. But the delineation and placing these kind of communities and putting them in sort of potential developmental trajectory like that, very, very helpful. So as we sort of then maybe begin to sort of wrap up and consolidate, what was it like for you putting this together? Where are you now in connecting this to the Enlightenment Worldview Project, or what's on the edge of this now that we sort of, if you have a sense of these organizations, what are you seeing happening, or what do you hope happen? And what's your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, well, I wanted to be able to, defend this notion of Enlightenment 2.0, even though there are some people who would disagree with some of the, core framing, but that, for one thing, being mindful of of these points of disagreement. You know, being mindful that there is, you know, people who would disagree, you know, with the idea that we're using these master maps, or that they disagree that we're trying to find some sort of, you know, problem solution framing, you know, as some of the other, you know, first generation integrative approaches are doing. And I'm just mindful of that, you know.
Sure.
And so that, but also saying that there are approaches to addressing the greatest challenges of our time that can actually have a both and here. You know, there's already a both and baked into Enlightenment 2.0, but there's an even deeper both and baked in if you have an approach that, you know, integrates between Enlightenment 2.0 and warm data and dark Renaissance. So if those are all coming together, you know, then you're really capable of, you know, having something that can be implemented at the community level without saying that, you know, we have the solution. The solution is this. You know, so it becomes several of these second generation approaches are complex, adaptive in that regard.
And adjust and blend and create novel integrations and all that. Great.
Yeah.
Were the things that I know our primary task was to sort of delineate sort of the various approaches, and we did that very nicely. Were the things then when you came on that you wanted to discuss or share in addition to that, or things that you wanted to share, you know, let our audience in on as we kind of begin to wrap up here?
Yeah. I was thinking that, you know, there's a lot of the pieces of the puzzle that, you know, come together when people, you know, cooperatively, you know, co-create. And I'm willing to work with people on that. If some people have ideas that can be, you know, we can bring together, whether you're on board with this Enlightenment 2.0 or not. And there are ways in which we can do that. And, you know, so other things that I'm working on with this Enlightened Worldview Project is I saw that there were, you know, one thing I'm interested in is phenomenology, and the relationship to psychology and to social science. And this is where I'm reading the, you know, the integral theory books, Ken Wilber and various others. And there isn't enough of a connection to academic work. And I'm trying to understand this. I'm trying to understand a lot of the academic work that I'm reading in phenomenology. And I'm trying to put that together. I'm also trying to, you know, understand how that's related to, you know, 4E cognitive science. And also the relations to all these, you know, social science books that I'm reading. And I just took a stab at, you know, summarizing this with these, you know, kind of charts and tables and graphs. And I don't know if this is work that's people have already done. I've shown some of this to people, and they said, well, that's great. Maybe we could clean that up and, you know, make it, you know, more professional so that it could be published in some regard. Some of it is I'm doing it to understand it myself. I'm trying to understand the broad landscape. And some of it could be work that nobody has quite done yet. You know, so just for example, like I can ask you, what would you say is the relationship between academic phenomenology, 4E cognitive science, and you know, the inner development dimensions as outlined in the Hansi Freinack books, and the relationship to the psychology, the integrative psychology that you practice? You know? Yeah,
I mean, certainly in terms of, there are a lot of different ways to go about that. We can draw a couple of quick bridges. So phenomenology definitely plays a big role in 4E cognitive science. I mean, academic phenomenology, basically has its home predominantly in Husserl and then into Heidegger across a particular branch of philosophy. There are phenomenological approaches in psychology. Most notably, they're personalistic and humanistic approaches that embrace aspects of that, but they're not dominant. So of course, when we're talking about phenomenology, we're talking about the ways in which things present themselves to us in our lived experience in general, and then the systematic analysis of that and what does it mean for what we know from, say, a Husserl perspective, and then into an understanding of ontology, or being in the world, being in, and then around and for itself. We do Sartre and other kinds of notions. So there's that cluster of understanding. Merleau-Ponty picks up off of Husserl and is a very important philosopher to talk about the very, very tight relationship between perception and action in the 1940s, 50s, etc. He's a French philosopher. But when the cognitive science revolution goes, it comes into cybernetics in the 1940s, and that's an embodied feedback loop mechanism that's very systemic across a wide variety of different domains. But what emerges in relationship to that is essentially the computational algorithmic approach in classic artificial intelligence, because they start building what we now know as computers to process information and showing that as very analogous to human thinking, intelligence, problem solving. That explodes from the 1960s onward into the 1980s. But then it very much is seen start to run its course, precisely because artificial intelligence is not embodied in the organismic and psychic and cultural worlds, as it were, and the neurological worlds as well. So it's this disembodied structure. And then there are a lot of difficulties bridging formal computationalism to the way a human animal mind works. Okay. So then what you get is an emerging critique of the failure of artificial intelligence to be appropriately embodied and then cultivated in action. And then many of the early pioneers that would give rise to 4E cognitive science would look over at phenomenology and really also some old neo-behavioral traditions and place them in the organism or really agent-animal arena relation and argue that we absolutely need an account of cognition that takes phenomenologically seriously, both in terms of a feature by which people are operating in the world and a necessary sort of explanatory lens to contextualize it, which of course, if you're studying things like Deep Blue and the way it solves chess problems, that's very far away from human phenomenology. So just in relationship to the academic literature, 4E cognitive science has a very strong commitment to take phenomenological reflections very seriously, and they draw on Husserl some, but probably Merleau-Ponty the most in relationship to the way he contextualized the tight relation, say, between perception and action in a number of different works. So there is a pretty tight line there. The relationship between then, well, is cognitive science psychology? What's that relation? I would argue that the relationship to phenomenology in psychology finds its most obvious presentation in psychotherapy. Okay, so the whole role of psychotherapy, the central aspect of psychotherapy for many people is to create an effective therapeutic relation grounded fundamentally in both in empathy and the cultivation of trust. And what we could use John Vervaeke's language in an intersubjective participatory live dynamic, where I get your perspective, hold that perspective, and then participate in relationship to it. So me as a clinician, I need to be trained in the phenomenological approach. And I would really now, I'm actually really embracing the term the psyche as essentially the container for one's phenomenology. And more recently, I've been seeing how UTOK provides a framework for the psyche from the first person perspective. In fact, the coin, the iQuad coin really represents the placeholder for that. And then I can position that in a tree of knowledge, which is an external third person behavioral vantage point, and be able to see the first person empirical situated historical psyche in proper relationship to the more generalizable scientific nomenclatic behavioral approach and the human mental behavioral approach that the tree of knowledge and unified theory of psychology affords. So I think that UTOK situates us so that we can see, oh, here's the idiographic particular psyche from the first person empirical, and here's a general nomenclatic laws of behavior placed in a big history view that's actually specified what the animal mental and culture person planes are, which is absolutely crucial. And now we can contextualize third person empirical scientific views with first person empirical idiographic views. and then ultimately use the coin as the placeholder for the specific idiographic Gregg psyche from the world, or Brandon psyche. And then I believe if you have that situation, then the capacity to jump into the social sciences, both in terms of a more coherent ontology of what is a human person, and from the vantage point of like, okay, we're going to build academic systems that take seriously the human soul. It's another way of framing the psyche in this regard, and then afford us educational systems that are, appropriately aligned with that ontology, and to do so in a way that's actually fulfilling it rather than fundamentally undermining it and saying, no, there is no first person meaning, which is certainly vulnerable from some of the original Enlightenment stuff. So from a UTOK perspective, that network, is rich and crucial to the whole Enlightenment 2.0 project. Those are some reflections from where I'm coming from. I'd welcome any riffing off of that as you hear that.
Yeah, definitely. So where I was going with this is that there are several of these people who are doing this work that is essentially the intellectual foundation for the practices that are out there of different ways. And if we had this directory, that could be used by community leaders, I would think that the directory would be based primarily on something kind of like the Aqua model. And so I'm seeing that, and I'm not sure if anybody has done this yet. There's so much of what Vervaeke has talked about. I've listened to, maybe 100 hours of his content, and it can be, you can categorize and classify a lot of it, and also your work of other people, it can be classified within something kind of like that, so that when these community leaders are dealing with different kinds of problems, again, at the kind of sociological therapy, they would be able to draw from that as necessary. And the point of having this sort of correlation that I'm talking about is so that you can have a translation between these different systems. There's a lot of overlap, conceptual overlap between academic phenomenology and 4E cognitive science that, without these sort of maps, that you might think that you're talking entirely different. You're talking different languages sometimes, but there's a conceptual overlap. So I was taking a stab at having this, to aid these community leaders.
Totally.
And there'd be a little bit of a learning curve to even get there to be able to use it. But I think there would be a process of even translating this into everyday language as well.
Totally.
So that's what I'm talking about.
Great.
And I just wanted to throw that out there if anybody
love it
wants to co-create on that.
Yeah, and in fact, just the parallels with UTOK. I mean, the tree is science, tree of knowledge, and the scientific third person. Coin is first person idiographic phenomenological, and then garden is social collective narrative, sense making. So you certainly have an it, I, we dynamic there. It's a very, very powerful pronounal perspective that's useful across a wide variety of different domains. So it's really cool that you're looking to sync that up and then use that as a kind of directory and help people serve as that guide. And that's certainly something I resonate deeply with to give my own theoretical architectural work.
And again, I'm not sure if what I'm talking about is kind of already out there. I just put this together because I was trying to understand what Vervaeke was saying, what you were saying, what others people were saying. And I didn't really see it quite. I mean, in Wilber's work, there's a lot of, speculative stuff.
Right. Wilber does a great job of boxing the, for me, Wilber does a great job of categorizing the pronounal epistemological perspectives, which is absolutely central and a very useful frame. John and I think, are getting much closer on delineating the ontological structure. And I don't think Wilber gets that right. He doesn't capture the problem of psychology. If you can't capture the problem of psychology, you're not going to get the ontology right, in my estimation. But he gets a big chunk of the epistemological organization. And if we're part of Enlightenment 2.0 is affording our opportunity to get the ontology right as well, well then, hey, we're going to be able to, and then actually weave together it, I, we into particular, understand how they're different language epistemological games, but actually there's an underlying monist ontological ontic structure. And then boom, you get that coherence and you're singing, so that sounds great.
Yeah, so I'm just putting some of these things together that might be, you know, something nobody has quite done yet, and I think it would only get across the finish line through a lot of cooperation with people, you know.
Great.
So if anybody wants to, you
all
know,
right, well, we'll make sure that your contact information and people can look you up and shoot you notes in relation if this is a project that they would like to potentially collaborate and dialogue with you about.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Hey, man, Brandon, thanks so much for coming on the program. I think what you're doing, of course, with the Enlightenment Worldview Project, obviously, there's a whole lot of simpatico in relationship to that. I really appreciate the need to ground stuff. And I thought that you're, and certainly wanted to invite you on here precisely because that map of the various approaches to the meta-crises is exactly a very useful taxonomy, as it were, and description of the various things that are growing and helps people get a lay of the land and be more familiar with what's out there and what they may want to participate in. So I really appreciate that.
All right. Awesome. Thank you very much, Greg.
All right. You take care, Brandon. Good seeing you.
You too.